I am Joshua, 28, and my father publicly disowned me in front of 500 guests at my brother's wedding. Before I tell you about how I triggered the plan I had been building for years to expose the truth and brought my entire toxic family to their knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. I was standing at the very back of a massive, wildly expensive wedding barn packed with nearly 500 guests when my life split into a before and an after. I still remember the sound first. It was not the faces. It was the glasses clinking, polite, wealthy laughter, and a string quartet dragging out one last sweet note. My brother, Julian, was sitting at the head table with his beautiful new bride, Qley. He looked like the absolute picture of success. An elite cancer doctor, the golden boy, the man who could do no wrong. Then my father, Robert, rose to his feet. He lifted his champagne glass and turned what was supposed to be a standard wedding toast into a public execution. He smiled warmly toward Julian, his chest puffed out with that arrogant pride I knew so well. I only have one son, my father said into the microphone. His voice echoed off the high wooden rafters. That is the child I am proud of. Our groom today. He paused, and for a split second, I thought he was just doing his usual routine of praising Julian and ignoring me. But then he pointed directly to the back of the room, right at me. He did not even look me in the eye when he said it. That thing back there? Just a mistake. A disgrace to this family. A collective gasp ripped through the room. 500 people froze. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the barn. I stood there, my blood running cold, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes turning to look at me. Then my mother, Evelyn, sitting straight-backed in her pale silk dress, gave a tiny, dry laugh. She leaned toward the microphone and added, "We should have put it up for adoption when we had the chance." For one long second, nobody moved. Then the whispering started. It was low and hungry, spreading from table to table like fire through dry grass. Everyone was waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to cry, to yell, to make a scene that would confirm exactly what my parents had just called me. Unstable, a mistake, a piece of trash. I smiled. I actually smiled because if I let my face crack right there, I knew I would collapse in front of every person they had ever performed their perfect family routine for. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached, and a vein throbbed against my temple, but my face remained perfectly calm. I picked up my jacket, turned around, and walked out the double doors without saying a single word. I did not run. I walked, but inside my head, something old and buried finally stood up. I had spent years building a plan for the day they pushed me too far. They had just chosen the stage for me. The moment I stepped into the cool night air, the terrified, unwanted little boy inside me died forever. In his place was a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. I made it to my car before my knees finally gave out. The bright lights of the wedding barn blurred behind me in the rearview mirror as I drove down the long, dark gravel road. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were stark white and my fingers cramped. I pushed the gas pedal down, putting as much distance between myself and that toxic nightmare as possible. I did not cry right away. That is the strange thing about absolute humiliation. When it becomes too large to fit inside your body, sometimes it does not come out as tears. Sometimes it becomes a silence so cold it feels borrowed from a grave. I drove for about 20 minutes, the radio completely off, just listening to the hum of the engine and the tires against the asphalt. Eventually, I pulled over on the shoulder of the highway. I killed the engine and sat there in the pitch black while large semi-trucks thundered past me like distant storms. My chest was tight, and my breathing was shallow. I reached into the glove compartment, pulled out my wallet, and opened a hidden fold. I pulled out 3 old photographs I had carried for years. They were bent at the corners and soft from being handled too much. Most people keep pictures in their wallets for comfort. I kept mine as evidence. The first photo was from a middle school science fair. I was 13 years old, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting button-down shirt I had ironed myself because my mother was too busy. In the photo, I am standing next to a project I had spent 3 months building. I am smiling so hard it looks painful. What the photo does not show is what happened after the flash went off. I had searched the crowded gymnasium the entire evening, completely convinced my parents would appear. I thought they would run in late, breathless, apologizing, and telling me how proud they were. Instead, they were across town watching Julian receive another shiny academic trophy. When the fair ended, I watched other kids run into their parents' arms, celebrating. I stood behind my table alone until the school janitor asked if I needed to use his phone to call for a ride. That night, I had walked 3 miles home in the dark. When I got there, I locked myself in the bathroom, sat on the cold tile floor, and pressed a towel so hard against my mouth to stop myself from sobbing that I actually threw up from the physical strain. I remember staring at the mirror afterward, my eyes red and swollen, and thinking, maybe if I work harder, maybe if I am better, they will come next time. Isn't it pathetic how long a child can mistake blatant neglect for a challenge instead of a verdict? Looking at that photo in the dark of my car, I felt a deep wave of disgust. Not for myself, but for the parents who could throw a child away so easily. My entire life, every cent of my hard-earned salary had gone toward proving I was worth their time. I was done proving myself. The truth was, the deck had been stacked against me since the day Julian was born. I leaned my head back against the driver's seat and let the memories flood in. My family functioned on a very specific, ruthless hierarchy. Julian was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets meant to orbit him and keep him warm. Everything in our house was designed to elevate my brother. When it came time for college, I found out the hard way exactly where I stood. I had worked 2 jobs in high school, assuming my parents would at least help me with tuition the way they were helping Julian. But when the acceptance letters came, my father sat me down in his study. He did not even offer me a seat. "We are liquidating your college fund," he had told me, his voice flat and businesslike. "Julian's medical school track requires significant financial backing. He is an investment. You, Joshua, need to learn the value of hard work. You can take out loans." He did not just take the money. He took my future and handed it to Julian on a silver platter. I watched my brother drive a brand new car off to a prestigious university, while I worked night shifts at a warehouse just to pay for community college credits. Julian never thanked me. He never acknowledged the sacrifice. He just smiled his perfect, practiced smile and accepted it as his birthright. Over the years, Julian learned how to weaponize my parents' favoritism. He was brilliant at it. He never had to get his hands dirty. If he made a mistake, he knew exactly how to twist the narrative so the blame landed squarely on my shoulders. When he wrecked his car drunk at 19, he told my parents I had given him the keys and encouraged him to drive. They did not even ask for my side of the story. My father threw me out of the house for a week. Julian watched from the window sipping a soda. That was the dynamic. As long as Julian looked like a savior, a genius, an elite cancer doctor, my parents could parade him around the country club and soak up the admiration of their wealthy friends. They needed Julian to be perfect to validate their own fragile egos. And to make him look brighter, they needed me to be the dark, troubled shadow. I was the cautionary tale they told at dinner parties. "Oh, poor Joshua. He just can't seem to get his life together. Thank God we have Julian." They had built a massive, glittering house of cards on top of my back. And sitting there on the highway, with the echo of 500 people laughing at me still ringing in my ears, I realized something vital. If I pulled myself out from under them, the whole damn house was going to come crashing down. I flipped to the second photo in the stack. It was a picture of me and my grandfather, David. It was taken on his back porch 2 summers before he passed away. He had one heavy, weathered hand resting on my shoulder, his old straw hat tipped back against his head. His eyes were cloudy by then, but whenever he looked at me, he made me feel seen. It was a kind of unconditional love that almost hurt to experience because it was so rare in my life. Grandpa David was the only person who saw through the charade my parents put on. He used to sit me down on the porch steps, hand me a glass of iced tea, and whisper whenever no one else was listening, "You are the strongest one in this family, Joshua. Do not let them break your spine." At the time, I thought he meant it as simple comfort. Years later, sitting in my car, I realized it was an apology. He knew exactly what kind of house I was growing up in. He knew what it meant that Julian's science fair ribbons and medical school acceptance letters were framed in the grand hallway, while my modest achievements disappeared into kitchen junk drawers or the trash. A week before he died, Grandpa David called me into his hospital room. The machines were beeping softly, and he looked incredibly frail. He reached out with a trembling hand, gripped my wrist with surprising strength, and made me promise him something. "Joshua," he rasped, "promise me you will never beg for love from people who are too hollow to give it. You walk away." I promised him, of course. I promised him with tears streaming down my face. And then I spent the next decade breaking that promise every single day. I kept going back. I kept trying to fix a machine that was designed to crush me. When Grandpa David died, my father turned the funeral into a networking event. He shook hands with hospital administrators over the casket, using his own father's death to push for Julian's upcoming promotion. I remember standing in the rain at the cemetery, watching my father hand out business cards, feeling a profound, sickening disgust. My grandfather's estate, a modest but meaningful inheritance, mysteriously vanished into my mother's investments before the dirt on the grave was even settled. I never saw a dime of it, but Julian suddenly had the down payment for a luxury condo. Staring at the photo of Grandpa David, I traced the edge of his face with my thumb. The third and final photo was of my Aunt Sarah. "Joshua, listen to me," she said fiercely. "One day, the truth about this family will come due. You just make sure you are the one holding the receipts." At the time, I thought she meant karma in some vague spiritual sense. I thought the universe would eventually step in and punish them for their cruelty. Sitting there on the shoulder of the highway, having just been discarded like garbage in front of 500 wealthy socialites, I finally understood what she really meant. She meant debt. Real debt. The kind that accumulates massive interest over time. My parents only understood one language: consequences. They did not stop when you cried. They did not stop when you pleaded. They would only stop when the cost of their cruelty became too expensive to bear. And unlike the shaking little boy standing alone at the science fair, I was no longer waiting for them to choose me. I was done auditioning for basic human decency. I put the 3 photos back into my wallet and tucked it securely away. I reached out, turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I merged back onto the highway and drove home with a strange, terrifying calm settling over my chest. By the time I turned into my driveway, I already knew that what happened in that wedding barn was not the worst thing they had ever done to me. It was simply the last thing. My house was dark when I walked through the front door, but I did not bother turning on the lights right away. I stood in the entryway, my suit jacket in one hand, my car keys tightly clenched in the other, and just listened to the steady sound of my own breathing. I was perfectly sober, perfectly awake, and absolutely dangerous. I walked directly to my home office. I bypassed the main desk and went straight to the heavy oak bookshelf in the corner. Behind a row of old college textbooks, I pulled out a small, locked fireproof safe. I punched in the code, the heavy metal clunked open, and I pulled out a small black digital voice recorder and a thick USB drive. I had bought that recorder 4 years earlier. Back then, my suspicion was still something I hated myself for. I still desperately wanted to believe there had to be some hidden reason for my father's coldness, some explanation that would make the architecture of my family less monstrous. But monsters rarely hide behind fangs and claws. Most of them hide behind expensive suits, polite manners, and country club memberships. I sat down at my desk, booted up my laptop, and plugged in the USB drive. I clicked through a maze of hidden folders until I reached one securely labeled Tax Receipts 2019 to 2023. That label was fake, of course. Inside was a digital graveyard. Photos, banking notes, dates, and audio files. Years of fragments. Years of quietly observing while my family assumed I was too much of a failure to be a threat. I clicked on the first audio file. It was dated 18 months ago. I hit play. At first, The speakers hissed with the sound of traffic noise and rustling fabric from inside my father's luxury sedan. I had slipped the recorder under his passenger seat after he borrowed my car jumper cables. Then my father's voice came through. It was low, intimate, and warm in a way I had never, ever heard him speak to my mother. "You are the only person I can be real with, Elena," my father murmured to a woman who was definitely not his wife. Elena was a senior administrator at his hospital. A woman who wore a shiny wedding ring and smiled brightly at my mother during company fundraisers. "My wife only knows the version of me I perform. It's exhausting. You're the real thing." I had listened to that recording dozens of times over the past year. The words should have gone numb by now, but they never did. My hands still trembled every single time. There is something uniquely grotesque about hearing the man who ruthlessly lectured you about morality and family values speak like a pathetic coward in love with his own reflection. My father's pristine reputation, his high-status job, his entire moral high ground was built on a filthy, hypocritical lie, and I had it right here in my hand. I minimized the audio file and opened the next folder. This one was dedicated entirely to my mother, Evelyn. She had spent decades meticulously building herself into the kind of woman local lifestyle magazines called graceful, philanthropic, and community-minded. But beneath the tailored Chanel dresses and polished charity luncheons was a desperate gambler of a very different kind. My mother had sunk massive amounts of money into underground investment circles, miracle wellness ventures, and private real estate deals pitched by wealthy women who promised exclusivity and legacy wealth. She had quietly drained every single account she had access to. I found the first clue entirely by accident while helping her set up a new laptop 2 years ago. One stray email about an overdue notice led to another. A missed payment led to a lawsuit threat. And eventually, the whole elegant house of cards revealed itself. She had refinanced their massive home in secret. She had borrowed heavily against my father's retirement accounts. And worst of all, she had taken out massive personal loans from a woman named Mrs. Montgomery, her supposed best friend from the country club. Why did she need so much cash? Not just to maintain her own lifestyle. She was funneling money directly into Julian's life to maintain the illusion of his massive success. The luxury condo Julian lived in, Evelyn paid the down payment. The expensive PR firm Julian hired to boost his profile at the hospital, Evelyn covered the retainer. She was buying her golden child's perfection with money she did not have. Right now, looking at the scanned documents on my screen, I saw the final nail in her coffin. Mrs. Montgomery was done playing nice. I had intercepted a legal letter sent to my mother's private P.O. box. It was a formal notice of intent to sue for breach of contract and seize assets. The queen of the local social scene was secretly drowning in debt, and her friends were getting ready to publicly strip the crown from her head. I printed the legal notices, the bank transfer records, and the loan agreements. I neatly stacked the papers and slid them into a crisp, unmarked manila envelope. My mother had stood in front of 500 people tonight and said I should have been put up for adoption. I wondered how eager she would be to talk about adoption when she was homeless and facing a fraud investigation. Finally, there was Julian, my brother, the family masterpiece, the elite doctor whose medical achievements supposedly outshone my very existence. My parents praised him so relentlessly that even Julian started to believe his own hype. On paper, he was flawless, but I had watched the machinery up close. I knew how he edited his stories. I knew how he weaponized silence. I opened the folder titled The Golden Sun. Inside were dozens of screenshots. How did I get them? Julian is arrogant, but he is incredibly careless with his technology. When he upgraded his phone a year ago, he asked me to wipe the old one to sell it, assuming I was too stupid to look inside. He was wrong. I backed up everything. Julian, the devoted, loving groom who had just married the beautiful, trusting Qley, was a predator. The screenshots were a parade of late-night texts, deleted dating app profiles, and explicit photos. He was actively sleeping with 2 different nurses at his hospital and aggressively pursuing a young medical resident. One text exchange with his colleague, Dr. Harris, made my stomach turn. Harris had asked Julian if he was really going to go through with marrying Qley, considering his side projects. Julian had replied, "Qley is wife material, looks great at galas, comes from good money. The nurses are just stress relief." I stared at Julian's arrogant words on my monitor. He had let my parents strip me down and humiliate me in public tonight because it preserved the hierarchy that fed his ego. He never had to insult me directly. All he had to do was stand on the pedestal they built using my bones. The cruelest people are often the ones who keep their hands perfectly clean while others do the hitting for them. I saved the screenshots to the master USB drive. I had my father's infidelity. I had my mother's financial ruin. I had my brother's disgusting double life. The ammunition was fully loaded. Now, I just needed to figure out exactly how to pull the trigger. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk, drinking black coffee, organizing files until the sun started to rise. At 6 a.m., I picked up my phone and sent a text to the only person in the world I fully trusted, Matthew. "I need you today. No questions. Please." Matthew and I had met in college. He was the one person in my adult life who never asked me to make my pain smaller so others could feel comfortable around it. He replied less than a minute later, "On my way." Matthew arrived at my front door an hour later. He walked into my home office, took one look at my face, and sat down in the chair opposite my desk. "What happened?" he asked quietly. I did not summarize. I did not soften the blow. I told him exactly what my father and mother had said into the microphone in front of 500 people. I told him how Julian just sat there and let it happen. Matthew's jaw tightened, and his hands balled into fists on his knees. Then, I turned my laptop around and pushed it toward him. "Before you tell me not to do something stupid, just read this. Listen to this." For the next hour, Matthew sat in dead silence. He listened to my father's affair recordings. He read through my mother's financial disaster. He scrolled through Julian's sick text messages. The only sound in the room was the occasional heavy sigh or a muttered curse word under his breath. When he finally finished, he leaned back, rubbed both hands over his face, and stared at the ceiling. "Joshua," he said heavily, "this is so much worse than I thought. If you expose this, it's not just going to embarrass them. It's going to destroy their lives. You will lose them permanently." I met his eyes with a calm that surprised even me. "I lost them a long time ago, Matt. Last night was just the first time they made sure 500 other people saw it, too." Matthew looked at me for a long time. Then, he reached across the desk and pressed his hand flat against the manila envelope of evidence. "All right," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Then we don't do this messy. If you explode on social media, they will paint you as the crazy, jealous brother. We do it clean. We put them in a room where they think they still control the script, and then we take the script away. We need witnesses, and we need maximum pressure." I smiled grimly. "That's exactly why I called you." Matthew and I spent the rest of the day refining the strategy. We abandoned the idea of some immediate, chaotic public explosion. Exposing people is not about throwing secrets into the air and hoping they land. It is about timing, pressure, and irrefutable order. We needed containment first, fracture second, and exposure third. "You need at least one more pair of eyes in the room," Matthew said, pacing across my rug. "Preferably someone whose opinion Julian actually fears. Someone with a strict moral compass." "Qley," I said immediately, "my new sister-in-law. She was smart, composed, socially respected, and completely naive about the rot hiding beneath her new family's portrait. If Julian's secrets were exposed in front of her, he would have nowhere to hide." "Exactly," Matthew agreed. "We invite them over for dinner. Not today. Too abrupt. 2 days from now. Just enough time for everyone to cool down and assume you've accepted your punishment." I pulled out my phone. I needed to send a message that sounded restrained, defeated, and ashamed. I hated playing the victim, but Matthew was right. Narcissists like my parents are always most vulnerable when they think they have broken you back into obedience. I drafted the text and read it aloud to Matthew. Dad, Mom, Julian. I don't want things to stay the way they were after the wedding. We should talk privately. Dinner at my place, Thursday at 7 p.m. Please come. Bring Qley. I would like to apologize and fix this before it gets worse. I hit send. Felt like swallowing glass, but I knew the bait was perfect. My father replied 2 hours later with a single arrogant word. Fine. My mother sent absolutely nothing. Julian responded late in the afternoon. For Qley's sake, let's act like adults. We will be there. I almost laughed out loud at that text. Act like adults. As if publicly calling your own flesh and blood a mistake in front of 1,000 guests was a hallmark of mature adulthood. The trap was set. They were walking right into the slaughterhouse, completely convinced they were the butchers. The next 48 hours were purely about logistics. I was not going to leave a single detail to chance. I duplicated all the audio files onto a hidden drive and uploaded a secure copy to a cloud folder. I printed selected financial documents and sealed them in thick envelopes. Matthew came over on Thursday afternoon to help me set the physical stage. My house was modest, but I cleaned it until it shined. I set the dining table exactly the way my mother built every holiday table growing up. Tasteful, controlled, and deceptive. I lit candles. I aligned the water glasses. I put an expensive roast in the oven so the house smelled inviting. I wanted them to walk in and feel a false sense of absolute superiority. Test the audio, I called out to Matthew. I had placed a sleek, high-end Bluetooth speaker directly in the center of the dining table, disguised next to a floral centerpiece. Matthew pressed a button on his phone from the hallway, and my father's voice purring to his mistress filled the dining room with crystal-clear precision. Perfect, Matthew said, stepping into the room. He had a secondary role tonight. He wasn't going to sit at the table with us. He was going to be in my den, just down the hall, with the door cracked open. If things spun out of control or if my father got violent, I wanted a reliable, physically capable witness on site. But Matthew had added one final, devastating twist to the plan. I made a phone call today, he told me, pulling a small audio routing device from his bag. I have a contact who works as an executive assistant for Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling was the head of the hospital foundation board, the man who controlled my father's job and Julian's upcoming promotion. What did you do, Matt? I asked, my heart hammering. I told the assistant that Robert and Julian were going to have a highly sensitive family conference regarding some hospital liabilities tonight. I told her Mr. Sterling needed to dial into the secure line at exactly 7:30 p.m. to listen in silently. I routed the microphone in the dining room directly to this line. I stared at him, stunned. You're wiring the room? If Sterling hears this, my dad's career is instantly over. That is the point, Joshua, Matthew said coldly. They cut you down in front of 500 people. You are going to burn their empire to the ground with one phone call. At 6:45 p.m., headlights flashed across my front window. I stood by the table, straightening my tie. My pulse steadied instead of spiking. I felt a terrifying, absolute calm. The players had arrived. The stage was set. It was time to pull the curtain back. At exactly 7 p.m., the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the hallway. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat in my ears. I took one last deep breath, smoothed the front of my shirt, and walked over to open the door. The moment I turned the handle and pulled the door wide, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of my childhood rushed into my home. My father, Robert, stepped over the threshold first. He did not say hello. He did not offer a handshake. He simply looked around my modest living room with a thinly veiled expression of distaste, as if the air in my home was somehow beneath him. He was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit, looking every bit the authoritative patriarch. Evelyn, my mother, followed closely behind him. The sharp, overwhelming scent of her expensive designer perfume instantly overpowered the warm smell of the dinner I had prepared. She carried a limited edition handbag shield-like across her chest and refused to meet my eyes. Julian entered next, his hand resting lightly on the small of Qley's back. Julian looked like a man stepping down from a throne to visit the peasants. He wore a patronizing, benevolent smile, the kind of smile you give a misbehaving dog that finally learned to sit. He parked his brand new Porsche in my driveway, making sure it was angled perfectly under the street lamp so the sleek lines were visible from the front window. "Joshua," Julian said, his voice dripping with practiced warmth. "It is good of you to reach out. Really, it takes a big man to admit when he has caused a scene." I stared at him for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer audacity of his statement wash over me. He was standing in my house, pretending that I was the one who had ruined his wedding by quietly walking out after being publicly humiliated. "Come in," I said evenly, gesturing toward the dining room. "Dinner is ready." Qley gave me an apologetic, tight-lipped smile. "Thank you for having us, Joshua. The house smells wonderful." She was the only one who seemed genuinely uncomfortable, her eyes darting between her new husband and me, clearly sensing the invisible landmines scattered across the floorboards. We moved to the dining room. I had set the table perfectly. The crystal water glasses caught the candlelight, the silverware was perfectly aligned, and the roast sat in the center of the table, looking like a magazine spread. I took my seat at the far end of the table. Robert sat opposite me, assuming the position of power. Evelyn sat to his right, Julian and Qley to his left. For the first 10 minutes, we went through the agonizing motions of a normal family dinner. Plates were passed. Water was poured. Qley desperately tried to smooth the tense air with harmless questions about my work and recent travels. I answered politely, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Julian chimed in with his practiced, warm doctor voice, subtly redirecting every topic back to his own recent achievements at the hospital and the upcoming board review for his massive promotion. Every now and then, I caught my mother studying me from across the table. Her eyes were narrowed, assessing me. She was waiting for the emotional breakdown. She was waiting for the tears, the frantic apology, the instability she could categorize and use to validate her cruelty. My father barely spoke, eating his food with stiff, fake civility, wearing the expression of a man granting forgiveness he was never entitled to withhold. When the main course was nearly finished, Julian wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, set it down beside his plate, and intertwined his fingers. He leaned forward, adopting his best bedside manner. "Joshua," Julian began, his voice dropping into a serious, commanding register. "I think we are all here tonight because what happened at the wedding got a little out of hand." I stopped chewing. I placed my fork down on my plate. The metallic clink was the only sound in the room. I looked directly at my brother. "Out of hand," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "Not cruel, not monstrous, just a little disorderly." Julian sighed, a heavy, condescending sound. "Nobody is saying Dad used the best choice of words, but you have to understand the pressure we were under. You have always been difficult. You make things heavy. We are willing to put this behind us if you are willing to take responsibility and apologize to Qley and me for walking out and causing a distraction." I nodded slowly, acting as if I were genuinely considering his generous interpretation of the events. "You know what, Julian? You are right," I said softly. My father's shoulders immediately relaxed. A smug, victorious smirk touched the corner of my mother's mouth. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken my spine completely. "It did get out of hand," I continued, my voice growing colder, harder. "That is exactly why I invited all of you here tonight. I thought maybe, for once in 28 years, we could stop pretending." The temperature in the room plummeted. My father's jaw tightened, the smugness vanishing instantly. Qley looked from face to face, her brow furrowing, sensing the massive shift in the atmosphere before she could fully understand it. My mother gave a dry, irritated little sigh and crossed her arms. "If this is going to be another one of your emotional performances, Joshua, I am simply not interested. We did not come here to be lectured." I smiled directly at her. It was not a warm smile. "No, Mom. This is not a performance. This one comes with documents. Nobody spoke. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up, walked over to the wooden sideboard against the wall, and picked up the small, black Bluetooth speaker. I walked back and placed it directly in the center of the dining table, right next to the floral centerpiece, like an extra course they were forced to swallow. Julian's eyes narrowed to slits. He leaned back in his chair. What is that? I sat back down and folded my hands on the table. The reason this conversation is finally going to stay honest. My father pushed his chair back half an inch. It was a tiny movement but a massive tell. He was preparing to fight or flee. Joshua, he said, warning laced heavily into his tone. Whatever childish stunt you think you are pulling tonight, I suggest you stop right now. I did not break eye contact with him. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and pressed play. At first, the dining room filled with the muffled, static sound of traffic and the rustling of fabric. My father frowned, confused. Then the audio cleared up. My father's voice emerged from the speaker. It was unmistakable. It was softer, more vulnerable, and more intimate than any of us had ever heard him speak inside our own home. You are the only person I can be real with, Elena, the recorded voice murmured, the words dripping with desperate affection. Qley frowned deeply, glancing at Julian in confusion. My mother's hand froze mid-air, her fingers tightly gripped around the stem of her crystal water glass. The color began to drain from her face. The recording continued, loud and perfectly clear. My wife only knows the version of me I perform. It is completely exhausting playing the perfect husband for Evelyn. You are the real thing, Elena. I can't wait until I can stop pretending. My mother went paper white so fast it was almost theatrical. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly toward my father, who was staring at the speaker as if it were a live grenade. Turn that off, Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling violently. I did not move a muscle. My father lunged forward across the table, his arm knocking over his wine glass. The dark red liquid spilled across the white linen tablecloth like a fresh wound. He slammed his hand down on the speaker, violently hitting the pause button and knocking the device sideways onto the floor. This is insane, he barked, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. Qley was staring at my father with wide, horrified eyes. Who is Elena? She asked, her voice shaking. Is that the hospital administrator? Julian cut in immediately, his hands raised in a placating gesture, slipping instantly into damage control mode. Qley, don't listen to this. My mother made a broken, guttural sound in the back of her throat. It was not a sob. Not yet. It was the horrific noise of someone realizing their absolute humiliation now had an audience. She had spent decades building a flawless image, and I had just set it on fire in front of her new daughter-in-law. Robert, she said, looking at my father with desperate, pleading eyes, begging him to hand her a version of reality she could actually survive in. Tell me this is a joke. He did not answer her. He did not even look at her. He was staring at me with naked, unadulterated hatred. It was the pure, unfiltered hatred he used to keep carefully hidden behind his masks of disappointment and stern parenting. You piece of garbage, Robert hissed, his hands balled into tight fists on the table. I ignored him. I reached down to the floor beside my chair, picked up the thick manila envelope, and slid it directly across the table until it hit my mother's dinner plate. Open it, I commanded. Evelyn stared at the brown envelope as if it were covered in venom. She shook her head rapidly, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. She refused to touch it. I said open it, I repeated, my voice rising slightly. Julian grabbed the envelope instead. He tore the top open aggressively and pulled out the thick stack of papers, spreading them across the table in front of him and Qley. His eyes scanned the top page, and I watched the arrogant confidence completely evaporate from his face. Overdue notices, massive bank transfer records, Final legal warnings. Aggressive investment summaries dripping with fraud and massive losses. And right on top, the formal lawsuit drafted by Mrs. Montgomery's lawyer, detailing the seizure of my parents' assets. "Mom," Julian said, his voice suddenly thin and reedy, devoid of all its usual power. "What is this? This says you owe millions. This says the house is leveraged. What the hell is this?" Evelyn blinked rapidly at the papers, her hands shaking violently in her lap. It is temporary," she stammered, the words rushing out too fast. "I was handling it. It was a bad quarter for the portfolio. I am managing it, Julian. It is not what it looks like." I threw my head back and laughed. I actually laughed out loud because I simply could not help it. The sheer absurdity of their delusion was staggering. "That is the family motto, isn't it?" I said, looking around the table at their pale, terrified faces. "We are handling it. We are managing it. It is not what it looks like." Meanwhile, all of you treated me like I was the unstable, broken one because I was the only person who pointed out the heavy smoke pouring under every single door in this house. My father slammed his palm against the table so hard the silverware jumped and clattered against the plates. "You vindictive little bastard," he roared. Qley flinched hard, shrinking back in her chair. Julian stood halfway up, holding the financial papers. "Dad, stop. We need to figure out what this debt is." But I was already moving. I reached down, scooped the Bluetooth speaker off the floor, set it back on the table, and hit play on the second file. This time, it was not the affair that filled the room first. It was my father's cruel, dismissive laughter. "Julian understands what matters." My father's voice sneered from the speaker. "Julian is the future. He is a doctor. He has the prestige. Joshua is just baggage. We never should have carried him this long. He is dead weight." My mother closed her eyes, tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her perfect makeup. Julian went completely still. He froze in the exact way prey animals do when they hear something impossible and fatal at the exact same time. He slowly lowered the financial papers to the table. Qley turned slowly toward Julian, her face a mask of utter horror, then turned toward me. Comprehension was dawning on her in horrible, agonizing stages. "He said that about you?" Qley whispered, her voice cracking. "Your own father?" I looked directly into her eyes. "For 28 years, Qley. That recording is just one time he accidentally got caught saying it out loud. The rest of the time, he just showed it through action. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized. It was the sound of a submarine hull groaning right before it implodes. My father stood up so abruptly that his heavy dining chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. "This dinner is over," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. He grabbed his wine glass, completely furious, needing something to destroy. He hurled the crystal glass across the room toward the kitchen sink. It missed. The glass shattered violently against the marble counter, exploding into 100 sharp fragments. A massive shard sliced directly across the palm of his hand. Blood hit the pristine white floor tiles in bright, heavy drops. Evelyn screamed and jumped out of her chair, but she did not run to comfort him. She backed away toward the wall, trying to get away from the table, away from the papers, away from the collapsing reality. Julian looked as if the entire structural architecture of his perfect life had suddenly lost its load-bearing walls. He looked at the blood on the floor, the lawsuit on the table, and the speaker in my hand. "Joshua," Julian said. For the first time in his entire life, I heard absolutely no superiority in my brother's voice. I only heard raw, unadulterated fear. "Joshua, please, do not do anything else tonight." I met my brother's terrified gaze and felt my heart turn into a block of absolute ice. "Anything else?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean like telling Qley about the nurses in Dallas? Or the young medical resident you kept texting at 2 in the morning while Qley was picking out wedding invitations? Or should we talk about how quickly your moral outrage disappears whenever Dad humiliates me?" just as long as it keeps your bank accounts full and your ego shining. Qley's chair scraped violently against the floor as she pushed herself backward. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with a sick, dawning realization. What is he talking about, Julian? Julian turned to her so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. He reached out, trying to grab her hands. Qley, no. It's not true. Listen to me, he is lying. He is trying to ruin us because he is jealous. Qley yanked her hands away from him, backing up until her spine hit the wall. She pressed one hand over her mouth, looking at the man she had married just 7 days ago as if he were a complete stranger. I reached into the folder and pulled out a second stack of papers. Printed screenshots. Dozens of them. I tossed them onto the table. They scattered, covering my mother's debt papers. Pictures, texts, late-night hotel bookings. Read them, Qley, I said quietly. Julian's phone backs up to the family cloud server. He forgot to change the password when he bought his new phone. Julian lunged for the papers, trying to sweep them off the table, but Qley was faster. She snatched a handful of the printed pages and stepped back, her eyes frantically scanning the explicit text messages and photographs. I watched her read the message where Julian called her a prop and wife material for galas, while referring to the nurses as stress relief. A strangled sob tore out of her throat. But wait, it gets better, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. I looked directly at Julian, who was pale, sweating, and hyperventilating. You want to know where Mom got the millions of dollars she is currently being sued for, Julian? Julian froze, his eyes darting to our mother, who was sobbing hysterically by the doorway. She didn't lose it all in bad investments, I revealed, delivering the final, crushing blow. She pulled the equity out of this house. She drained Dad's retirement. And she borrowed from Mrs. Montgomery to pay for your life, Julian. The down payment on your luxury condo, the PR firm you hired to get that promotion, the designer watches and the country club fees. Your entire elite lifestyle is built on stolen money and massive fraud. You aren't a self-made golden boy. You are a parasite. Julian staggered backward as if I had physically punched him in the chest. He looked at Evelyn, who buried her face in her hands, unable to deny it. The golden sun was finally seeing the massive black hole that kept him burning. My father, still wrapping a cloth napkin tightly around his bleeding hand, kept cursing at me under his breath, repeating my name like a venomous spell, as if language itself could somehow restore his shattered authority. Julian came around the table, stepping over the broken glass, and stopped 3 feet away from me. His face had completely emptied out. The arrogant doctor was gone. Please, Julian whispered softly, desperately, glancing back at Qley, who was weeping silently against the wall. Not here. Not like this. Please don't say anything else. I'll do whatever you want. I'll give you money. Just stop. And there it was. The golden child on bent knees without physically kneeling, begging the sister, wait, the brother. He had let them erase his entire life. When the brother you spent your life hating finally stands in front of you, stripped of his halo, stripped of his power, and begs for mercy, what do? Do you forgive him, or do you let him feel the full, crushing weight of the ladder he climbed using your broken back? I did not answer him right away. I let the silence stretch. I let him stand in the absolute wreckage of his life. I let all of them stand in it. No one at this table, I said, my voice low and lethal, gets to decide my silence anymore. Qley let out one broken, bitter laugh. She threw the crumpled screenshots directly into Julian's face. She looked around the dining room, looking at the blood, the debt papers, the terrified faces of her new in-laws, as if she were finally seeing the world clearly for the very first time. This isn't a family, Qley said, her voice shaking with rage and heartbreak. This is a performance built on cruelty and lies. I am done. She turned on her heel and walked out of the dining room. Julian actually dropped to his knees in the foyer, grabbing the hem of her coat, begging her not to leave, his voice cracking so badly it barely sounded human anymore. Qley, please, we can fix this. I love you. "Don't touch me," she screamed. The heavy oak front door slammed shut a second later. The sound echoed through the silent house like a judge's final gavel striking the block. The verdict was in. This is the moment that changed everything, when I finally took back control of my life. Thank you for being patient and staying with me this far. You are amazing. Please help me like this video and comment the number 1 below, so I know you have been on this journey with me. This not only helps more people find this story, but also tells me that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. One by one, the family unraveled completely after the door slammed. The pristine, controlled atmosphere of the dinner had transformed into an active war zone, and I was the only one left standing without a scratch. My mother stumbled out of the dining room in tears, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her expensive purse. She looked at me one last time, mascara running down her cheeks in thick black lines. "How could you do this to us?" Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with self-pity. "We are your family." That was the moment something inside me snapped clean in two. I stood up so abruptly my chair crashed backward onto the floor. For the first time in my entire life, I did not lower my voice to make room for theirs. "How could I do this to you?" I shouted, my voice booming off the walls. "Do you want to compare damage, Evelyn? Because I can start from when I was 10 years old and go forward from there. You called me a mistake in front of 500 people. You said I should have been given away. And now that your own filthy secrets are sitting on this table with proof attached, suddenly I am the one who crossed a line." Robert stepped toward me, holding his bleeding hand against his chest. His face was a mask of pure, unrestrained malice. "You were always poisoned, Joshua." Robert spat, his eyes blazing. "You were born looking for a reason to destroy us. I will contact my lawyer in the morning. I am cutting you out of everything. You will not see a single dime of inheritance. You are dead to me." For one brief second, the old, traumatized version of me heard that and wanted to fold. I wanted to apologize and shrink back into the shadows. But the man standing in the dining room tonight heard it for exactly what it really was. A confession of his own profound weakness. Right at that moment, the door to the den opened. Matthew stepped out into the hallway. He was calm, solid, and physically imposing. He wasn't being dramatic. He was just present enough to make it explicitly clear to my father that I was no longer trapped alone inside their twisted version of reality. My father turned on him immediately. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Matthew didn't flinch. He leaned against the doorframe, crossed his arms, and looked at my father with utter disgust. "Someone who knows that exposure isn't betrayal, Robert. It's just consequences." That shut the room down just long enough for Julian to slowly pull himself up from the foyer floor. He looked pale, sweating, and completely shattered. He looked at me, his eyes hollow, and asked the question that finally revealed exactly who he was beneath all the expensive degrees and polish. "What do you want, Joshua?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "How much money do you want to keep this quiet?" I stared at him, genuinely amazed. Even then, even after watching his wife walk out the door in tears, even after seeing his parents' lives implode, he still thought this was a business negotiation. He thought there was some private cost to be settled so the family could go back to pretending. "I want the truth to stop costing only me," I said coldly. "Get out of my house." My father threw one last vicious threat over his shoulder about lawyers and custody of family assets, and then stormed out into the night. My mother followed him, weeping loudly. Julian lingered last, standing on my porch, looking at the dark driveway where Qley's car used to be. "You didn't have to do it this way," Julian whispered brokenly. I looked my brother straight in the eye and answered with the absolute calm I had earned through 28 years of pain. "You all made sure I did." I closed the door in his face and locked the deadbolt. By the next morning, the damage had already spread far beyond the four walls of my dining room. My phone was vibrating off the nightstand, completely full of missed calls, frantic texts, and voicemails. Julian had called 23 times. My mother had sent one single message that read, "You destroyed us." I stared at the screen for a long moment, drinking my coffee. Even now, she was rewriting the story. Not "you exposed us," not "you told the truth," but "you destroyed us." As if I had magically created the affair, the mountain of debt, the lies, and the profound cruelty they had built their lives upon. But the real explosion happened at 9 a.m. Matthew arrived at my house with fresh breakfast sandwiches and a grim smile on his face. He sat down at my kitchen island and opened his laptop. The wire worked perfectly, Matthew told me, pulling up his email. Remember the secondary part of the plan? Matthew had routed the audio from my dining room directly into a secure conference line. Mr. Sterling, the head of the hospital foundation board, had dialed in at exactly 7:30 p.m., expecting to hear a professional discussion about hospital liabilities. Instead, he sat in his home office and listened to my father admit to a scandalous affair with a senior hospital administrator. He listened to my brother's explicit texts and unethical behavior with nursing staff being read out loud. He listened to the entire polished facade of the elite medical family shatter into a million pieces. "My contact at the hospital just texted me," Matthew said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Sterling called an emergency meeting of the ethics committee at 8 a.m. this morning. Your father and Julian were both summoned. They didn't even have time to coordinate their lies." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The dominoes were finally falling, and they were falling hard. Exposure in a private dining room was one thing, but exposure in the professional arena where my father and brother derived all their power and arrogance? That was a fatal blow. By noon, none of it was private anymore. Qley had not gone to a hotel. She had gone straight to her parents' massive estate. Her father was a highly connected lawyer in the city. By 1 p.m., Qley's legal team had formally filed for an annulment and emergency divorce proceedings, citing severe emotional distress and fraud. But Qley didn't stop there. She was furious, heartbroken, and completely done playing the polite society game. She posted a cold, careful, and legally sound statement on her social media platforms about discovering profound betrayal, deceit, and deep cruelty inside the family she had just married into. She did not explicitly name anyone, but she didn't need to. In their wealthy circles, people were already viciously talking. The whispers that started at the wedding had turned into a roaring inferno of gossip. Then, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Someone, I still don't know who, perhaps a disgruntled guest, had recorded part of the wedding toast on their phone. The clip of my father publicly calling me a mistake, and my mother saying I should have been put up for adoption, was leaked to a local community Facebook group. Once those clips started circulating, the immaculate family image they had spent 3 decades polishing cracked wide open for the entire world to see. The fallout over the next 7 days was swift, brutal, and absolute. My father's downfall came first, and it was spectacular. The hospital foundation board, entirely driven by Mr. Sterling's fury over being deceived, launched a full internal investigation. The affair with Elena was bad enough, but using hospital resources and conference trips to facilitate it broke a dozen moral clauses in his contract. Donors immediately began asking questions. Wealthy benefactors pulled their funding commitments, refusing to be associated with a scandal. By the end of the week, Robert was placed on indefinite unpaid leave. He was forced to resign from his position on the board, stripped of his administrative standing, and pushed entirely out of the role he had spent his life using as proof of his absolute superiority. He didn't just lose his prestigious salary. He lost the reputation that had shielded his cruelty for years. He was a pariah. The lawyer he had threatened to call to cut off my inheritance abandoned him when the retainer check bounced. Then, it was Evelyn's turn to face the music. Her hidden debts, fake investments, and secret financial disasters spread through the exact same social circles where she had always performed elegance and control. Mrs. Montgomery's lawsuit became public record. When the other society wives realized Evelyn had been using their country club luncheons to scout for loans she never intended to repay, they turned on her like wolves. Creditors moved in fast. Because Robert's income was suddenly halted, the massive mortgage payments failed. Bank accounts were frozen pending fraud investigations. Legal notices were taped directly to their heavy oak front door. Friends vanished overnight. Invitations to galas and charity events stopped entirely. By Friday, Evelyn was facing the immediate loss of the multimillion-dollar house she had treated like a kingdom. She had traded her son's mental health for a crown, and now the bank was coming to repossess it. And then came Julian, the golden child, the sun around which the entire family orbited. He was supposed to survive it all. The golden boy always does, right? But Qley refused to stay silent. During the divorce negotiations, her powerhouse lawyer subpoenaed Julian's phone records. She started comparing timelines, hotel receipts, and lies. What she formally documented was enough to destroy not just the marriage, but Julian's pristine professional reputation. The annulment process moved forward with terrifying speed. Julian was forced to move out of the luxury condo Evelyn had illegally funded for him, because the bank seized it as part of the asset recovery. He had to pack his designer suits into garbage bags and move into a cheap, short-term rental on the outskirts of the city. At the hospital, the whispers followed him relentlessly. Questions about his highly unethical behavior, his late-night text messages to subordinates, and his lack of professionalism spread from the nurse's station to the surgical wing. The highly coveted promotion he had been bragging about at my dinner table? The board gave it to a quiet, hard-working female doctor who actually cared about her patients more than her PR image. Julian didn't lose his medical license, but he lost the one thing he valued most in the entire world: the myth that he was utterly untouchable. He was no longer the elite, brilliant prodigy. He was just a disgraced doctor going through a messy, public divorce, drowning in his mother's debt, and alienated from his peers. The machinery that had protected him his entire life was completely smashed to pieces. On the 7th night after the wedding, exactly 1 week after my father took the microphone and cut me out of the family, my doorbell rang. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. I walked to the door, pulled back the curtain, and looked out. All 3 of them were standing on my front porch. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door slowly. The sight before me was almost difficult to process. They did not look like the arrogant, wealthy family that had walked into my dining room just days ago. They looked broken. My father looked gray, hollow, and 10 years older. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and the bandage on his hand looked dirty. My mother was standing a few feet back, crying silently into a crumpled tissue, looking incredibly small without her designer handbag and arrogant posture. Julian stood on the porch like a man who had aged decades in a week. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders were slumped in defeat. "You made your point, Joshua," my father said, his voice raspy and devoid of all its former booming authority. "This has gone far enough. We are ruined." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just a profound, quiet emptiness. "No," I answered calmly. "It went far enough when you erased me in front of 500 people. It went far enough when you stole my college fund. It went far enough when you watched me cry and called me a burden. This is just gravity finally catching up to you." My mother stepped forward, her hands shaking violently. "Please, Joshua," she sobbed. "We are going to lose the house. Your father lost his job. We have nothing left. Please help us." Julian stepped forward last, the golden son, and this time he didn't just lower his head. He really did sink to his knees, right there on the hard concrete of my front porch, wearing a wrinkled shirt. The elite cancer doctor fell to his knees, looking up at the brother he had spent his entire life letting them destroy. "Please, Josh," Julian whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Tell people you exaggerated. Tell Mr. Sterling the audio was taken out of context. Call Qley. Tell her I can fix this. Please, I am begging you. Help me." I stood there for a long, heavy moment. I looked down at the man who had stolen my childhood, stolen my peace, and weaponized my parents' love. "Julian," I said, my voice incredibly soft, You are not kneeling here because you finally understand my pain. You are not crying because you feel bad for the decades of abuse I suffered. Julian shook his head frantically. I do. I'm sorry. No, you aren't. I cut him off, my voice hardening into steel. You are here because losing me never hurt you. Losing yourselves did. I am not your savior. And I am no longer your scapegoat. None of them could answer. They just stared at me, shivering in the cold night air. I stood there looking at the family that had called me a mistake, and I felt something I had never, ever felt before in my entire life. Absolute, unbreakable peace. I was never the mistake, I said quietly, looking directly into my father's eyes. I was the consequence. Then I stepped back, closed the heavy oak door, and slid the deadbolt into place, leaving them outside in the dark with the ruins they had built themselves. I walked back into my living room. Matthew was sitting on the couch, holding a cup of coffee. He had heard everything through the open window. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just raised his coffee mug toward me in a silent, respectful toast. I sat down in the armchair across from him and took a deep breath. The house was incredibly quiet, but for the first time in my life, the silence did not feel like a punishment. It did not feel like I was being ignored or isolated. It felt like freedom. The heavy, suffocating chain that had been wrapped around my chest since I was a little boy at a science fair was finally gone. I didn't just survive the fire they tried to burn me in. I collected the ashes and used them to bury their empire. Looking back on this entire nightmare, the greatest lesson I learned is about the illusion of toxic loyalty. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, that blood dictates you must endure endless disrespect, manipulation, and pain just to keep the peace. But the truth is, a shared last name is not a license for abuse. We often stay in toxic family dynamics because of the sunk cost fallacy. We think, I have loved them and tried to win their approval for 20 years. I can't just give up now. But holding on to a mistake just because you spent a long time making it will only cost you your future. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Setting boundaries is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of deep self-preservation. When people show you they are willing to sacrifice your mental health to protect their pristine image, believe them the first time. You are not obligated to be the collateral damage in someone else's performance. True freedom begins the exact moment you stop auditioning for love that was never meant for you, and realize that your peace is worth far more than their validation. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What is the one takeaway or lesson from this story that resonated with you the most? Share your perspective in the comments below, or simply drop the word good, so I know you appreciate the lessons this journey brought to light. Thank you for listening.